Morning, everybody. The passage that David read for us is one of the best-known stories of the Bible. Unfortunately, it's not one of the most redeeming stories. And that's one of the things that makes the Bible so really invaluable. And so, because it tells us not so much about what happens beyond the sky, but tells us a lot of what happens right here on earth. As we've talked about, there are passages in the Bible that are different kinds of literature. You certainly have the historical books, such as what we're reading now, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Those are relatively rooted in real history. We call it the court history of ancient Israel. But also, there's poetry, like the Psalms, or the songbook of Israel, but basically poems set to music. And there's myth. And we've talked about before, the myth being Genesis, for example, or even Exodus. And myth doesn't mean false, it just means not history. It's a narrative that really shapes and forms a people's understanding of themselves. I'm getting a little image on the Zoom meeting. I'm just wondering if everything's okay on the Zoom meeting. Okay. So let me, all right, that's my phone. I did not want to preach this passage today. I've, of course, referenced it many times, and we know that the perspective has been changing. Because while this story tells of a tragedy, of a painful tragedy, and you know, we here at Pilgrim Church, we have our annual Safe Church Sunday, where we recognize and realize that even in the church, there are people who have been abused, there are children who have been abused, people who should be safe here at church, and in every church, have not been safe. And just read the headlines of almost any newspaper and you will find a record of that abuse. Particularly heinous, the sexual abuse of children. And so we have always kept in the forefront our message about being a safe church. And you are a safe church when you are not a silent church, when you talk about it so that everyone's aware of what their responsibility is. And their responsibility is to say something. Silence kills. Silence is deadly. And so, while I didn't want to preach on this passage, I felt compelled to preach on this passage because we shouldn't turn away from the reality of what's happening in our world. And that's why I truly do love the Bible, because I find in it the story of human nature, and that has not changed. And if you need more evidence that human nature has not changed and that the Bible continues to speak to human nature, one of the reasons I was almost going to pass on this passage, the lectionary gives you 4 passages that you can choose from, and I could have chosen a different one. And I wasn't going to preach on this passage, and then they let Bill Cosby out of prison. I wasn't going to preach on this passage, and then Harvey Weinstein pleaded not guilty. And I felt compelled. One of the saddest parts of this story is not the content, but the history of the interpretation of this passage. For so much of our history, this story has been related as some kind of a love affair. And it's been related as somehow that Bathsheba was involved in ways that are just unbelievable. She becomes not only a participant in this scandal, but she actually becomes the protagonist in this scandal. I was searching the literature on this passage, and I saw a fascinating title, Bathsheba, a Seductress? Question mark. The story of David and Bathsheba by Professor Lisa Hui. And she talks about how there are many papers and scholarship done on this passage that suggest outright that Bathsheba was trying to seduce David from the beginning. I've heard it preached from pulpits. What was she doing up there on that roof? She knew that David could see her from there. The way we treat this story reflects the way we treat women in our society to this day. We read this story and we're looking for how to make Bathsheba culpable. One of the things is when you read this story, you'll notice a certain passivity in the character of Bathsheba, a certain compliance. David inquires about who this beautiful woman is. He actually gets the information before he acts. So there is no redeeming David in this story. He knows that she is Uriah's wife. He knows that Uriah is off fighting a battle for him and for Israel. He knows that this is the wife of a faithful servant of his. It's fascinating the way the story opens up. It was the time of war when kings go out to war. It was spring when kings go out to war. But David was at home. So we right away know that David has abandoned his responsibilities. He's supposed to be out there with the other kings fighting his wars for his nation. But his power and his privilege allow him to dodge the military service that he was obliged to give. That sound familiar to anybody? I'm not naming any names. My sermon today is about the corrupting power of power. And we all know the quote. Lord Acton said, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." Monarchs have historically been absolute rulers. And we see some absolute rulers in our world today that kill with impunity. I'm just reading the newspaper, y'all. I'm not talking out of school. The Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia had a journalist who was criticizing the regime of Saudi Arabia, Khashoggi, killed, mutilated, brutally. Everybody knows it. But because he is an absolute monarch, there's no power on this planet as yet that has held him accountable at all. Now, Bill Cosby and Harvey Weinstein aren't absolute monarchs, but they are kings in their own realm. what we understand of their crimes is that they exploited the power that they had over the women in their world. Women who understood that if they wanted an opportunity to advance their acting careers, they had to comply with the illicit wishes of these kings. Our culture has difficulty naming these crimes. We've heard the debate. Well, they didn't jump out of the bushes and grab them. They went to the hotel room. They went to their room. They knew what he wanted when they got there. All these kinds of things to mitigate the guilt of the man and to put the responsibility for the crime on the victim, so often the woman. And so we are conditioned by our culture when we read this story. And that was one of the things that even I learned by reading Professor Wee's paper. In the story and the way the story is told, and we know whoever gets to tell the story controls how the reader and the hearer understands what happened. And as we know, men wrote the Bible for men to redeem this character of David, who was arguably one of the greatest kings of Israel, but yet a very flawed individual. And so one of the things that I noticed was she says, throughout the narrative, Bathsheba never speaks. She is silent. And we can read that silence as her cooperation, her complicity. We don't see any force used against her. And so we have to come up with another term to really understand what's happening. First of all, what she said was, Bathsheba is not silent. Bathsheba has been silenced. And she's been silenced by the narrator. She's been silenced by the writer of the story, who doesn't recognize or include her voice. So much of the trial of these men, and so many rape trials, hinges on whether the voices of women can be heard at all. And the attorneys for the defense do everything they can to silence the woman, the women. And so we read this story and we see Bathsheba following instructions. David sends his messengers to bring her to the palace. She follows along. She came to him, all without any protest. Do not be confused. We don't know what Bathsheba said. We only know what the storyteller told us that she said. And she does not speak until the critical event must be announced. And she announces it in 2 words: I'm pregnant. So she's not silent. She has been silenced. So the term that we have to come to, because we again have been conditioned to only think it's rape if there is violence, overt power used to accomplish the perpetrator's end. Now, they're called messengers, but we don't know that they weren't soldiers. They're called messengers, but they were messengers of the king. And you do not deny the king an audience when the king requests one. The other thing that I noticed in her analysis of this story is, again, we assume certain things. We assume that Bathsheba knew why she was being summoned. But if you read the text carefully, if you put aside what you've been told about this story, if you read it as though you'd never read it in your life before and you only consider what's on the page, the character in this story we call Bathsheba has no clue what David is thinking. There's no evidence in the story that she even knew she was seen. David is in a superior geographical, spatial position and a superior power position, looking down on her. There's no evidence in the story that she knew he had seen her. And so when the king's messengers show up at her door saying the king wants to see you, why would she be reluctant to go? But we have read into this story her complicity through this compliance. He sends for her. She really has no choice. She comes to him. She really has no choice. He lays with her. She really has no choice. She goes home. She really has no choice. She sends David the word, I'm pregnant. And David, we didn't read the whole story, but just in a thumbnail. David then conspires. He doesn't start out to kill Uriah. He starts off to fool Uriah. Uriah's off at war, and so he sends a message first to the general saying, send Uriah home, give him a leave for a few days. And when Uriah comes home, he reports to the king, you called for me? He has no choice. Yes, I called for you. You've been out there fighting hard. You're doing a good job. I decided to give you a few days so that you can go home and relax. Thinking that he would go home after having been on the battlefield and lay and sleep with his wife. And then when she tells her husband that she's pregnant, then Uriah will think that he had a baby with his wife. But Uriah's faithfulness is juxtaposed against David's faithlessness. And it's again, a compelling story about all the things that David tries to do. He gets Uriah drunk and then sends him home. And Uriah sleeps on the doorstep and refuses to go inside and sleep in his bed. And when David says, why didn't you go home? Why didn't you go inside? Why didn't you sleep in your bed? He says, how could I in good conscience sleep in my bed with my wife while my comrades in arms are sleeping in the fields fighting the enemy? So the integrity of Uriah is juxtaposed against the absolute lasciviousness and lack of character of David the king. So when all of his ruses fail, he sends Uriah back to the front and sends a letter that he puts in Uriah's hand and says, give this order to your general. Uriah, being faithful again, dares not open the letter, but faithfully hands it to his leader, who opens it and sees the instruction, set Uriah at the front of the hottest battle, and then withdraw from him so that he will be killed. So David not only commits rape, he commits murder when he can't cover up the rape. So the term that we've come to understand the rape of Bathsheba, and that's what this story should be called, not the story of David and Bathsheba, not the love affair of David and Bathsheba. It should be called the rape of Bathsheba. So the term we've come to is called power rape. That whenever there is an imbalance in social, economic, political, or personal power, such that the subordinate person cannot not consent. They cannot give consent because they don't have the power to say no. That whenever there is a sexual relationship that has this gross difference in power, it is rape. It's sad that we have to delineate the different kinds of rapes. Date rape, power rape, rape. We've got members of the Congress who can't decide what rape really is. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And the reason we continue to have the kinds of violence against women that we do is that the power of men is not accountable to anyone. Power must be brought to accountability. Accountability is the only antidote for the corrupting power of power. Accountability is the only antidote for rape against women, for rape against any subordinate, for rape against children in our society. So we must continue, as difficult as it often is, to tell the truth. We must unsilence Bathsheba and let her speak. We must unsilence ourselves and speak up and speak out when we know the truth. You might ask, what would Jesus do? We have some evidence in our text about what Jesus would do. You know the story of the woman caught in the act of adultery. Again, is there more of a victim-blaming title than that? But Jesus stands with her against the men who would condemn, punish, and execute her. Jesus believed the woman, and I think that we should too. Let the people of God say, amen.